Chapter 2. The Game of Consciousness. One day the embraces of the Hindu god Shiva and his consort, Parvati, who have spent eternity wrapped in lovemaking, are interrupted by a sinister yogi named Narada. Narada says he can show them something that is even more delightful than love. It is a game of dice, an ancestor of today's Pachisi. Intrigued by his offer, the divine couple begin to play. Each of them cheats as much as possible, but no matter how long they play, the outcome is always the same: Shiva loses and Parvati wins. Shiva may have the advantage for a round or two, but he can never win a game. At one point Shiva is ahead. He has won a couple of Parvati's jewels, enraging her. Noticing that the angrier she grows, the more beautiful she becomes, he coaxes her into continuing. Parvati agrees to play if Shiva will wager his chief attributes: his trident, the crescent moon, and a pair of earrings. Of course Shiva plays and loses. But he refuses to accept this fact. After all, he is Shiva, the Lord of the universe. No living being can overcome me, he tells her. She replies, no living being can overcome you, it's true, accept me. In spite, she leaves him. She takes not only the trident and the moon and the earrings but a pair of snakes and even his last item of clothing, his loincloth. Shiva is not troubled by this outcome. He withdraws to the wilderness and leads the life of an ascetic, free from the preoccupations of the world, meditating in solitary peace. Parvati, on the other hand, feels lonely and frustrated without him. Intent on winning him back, she takes the form of a lovely tribeswoman, an untouchable in the Hindu caste system, with red lips, a graceful neck, and magnificent full breasts. She is so beautiful that even the bees in the forest are overcome with love. Shiva, roused from his meditation by the noise of the bees, sees Parvati in the guise of the tribeswoman and is overcome with desire for her. Coquettishly she says, I am looking for a husband who is omniscient, who is free and fulfills all needs, who is free of mutations and is the Lord of the worlds. Shiva says, I am that one. Parvati replies, you shouldn't talk to me that way. I happen to know that you have a wife who won your devotion by many austerities, and you left her in a flash. Besides, you are an ascetic, living free from duality. Even so, I want you. Parvati says that he must ask permission of her father, Himalaya, the lord of the mountain chain. Shiva approaches him, but Himalaya says, this is not right. You should not be asking me. You are the one who gives everything in all the worlds. At this point Narada reappears and tells Shiva, listen. Infatuation with women always leads to mockery. You're right, Shiva replies. I have been a fool. And Shiva withdraws to a remote part of the universe where even yogis cannot go. At this point Narada convinces Parvati and Himalaya to implore Shiva to return, and they do so by praising him lavishly. Mollified, Shiva comes back, and he and Parvati resume their reign in unity. Contrary to Einstein, this myth seems to be saying that God not only plays dice with the universe but constantly loses. Why should Shiva, the Lord of the universe, be lured into indulging in a form of strip pachisi? How can he lose? Who is his consort? Why does she win? By now it's common knowledge that myth contains meaning that is hard if not impossible to convey in ordinary discursive language. There are no doubt different levels of meaning, each with its own import. I will try to tease out the most significant aspects of this story. Shiva represents consciousness, what I have been calling variously Purusha, I, or I am, that is, consciousness in a sense much more universal than mere human awareness. Parvati represents Prakriti, the contents of consciousness, experience in all its forms, internal and external, what esoteric Christianity calls the world. At the beginning of the myth they are locked in union. There is no distinction between consciousness and its contents. Therefore there is no world. The Hindus call this state pralay, the state of primordial sleep that prevailed before the universe bestirred itself to manifest. The Hindu scripture known as the Rig Veda describes it. Then, before the beginning, There was neither death nor no death. No sign of night or day. The one breathed, breathless, through its own impulsion. And there was no other of any kind. Note that it's precisely the absence of the other that characterizes this primal repose. The dice game, introduced by Narada, the personification of discord, symbolizes the beginning of manifestation. No manifestation can exist without a distinction between self and other. But as I suggested in the previous chapter, this distinction is not the bailiwick only of conscious subjects, such as we imagine ourselves to be. It is the property of everything, because, as I indicated, even an atom or electron must have some sense of itself simply to cohere at all. It must perceive another in order to distinguish itself from that other and so maintain a stable existence. As weirdly mystical as this idea may sound, it is occasionally echoed even by the philosophers who are most seminal to the contemporary scientific worldview. One example comes from an essay concerning human understanding by John Locke, one of the grandfathers of the philosophy of nothing but. Although Locke made this statement almost as an aside, it would help inspire the whole trend of philosophical materialism in the coming centuries. We have the ideas of matter and thinking, but possibly shall never be able to know whether any mere material being thinks, or no, it being impossible for us, by the contemplation of our own ideas, without revelation, to discover whether omnipotency has not given to some systems of matter fitly disposed, a power to perceive and think, or else joined and fixed to matter so disposed, a thinking immaterial substance, it being, in respect of our notions, not much more remote from our comprehension to conceive. That God can, if he pleases, superadd to matter a faculty of thinking, then that he should superadd to it another substance with a faculty of thinking. For I see no contradiction in it, that the first eternal thinking being should, if he pleased, give to certain systems of created senseless matter, put together as he thinks fit, some degrees of sense, perception, and thought. Locke himself, later in the same book, argues against the idea that matter can be conscious. Nonetheless, it was his suggestion that matter could possess some degrees of sense, perception, and thought, that would eventually lead to the attempt to equate the mind with the functioning of the brain or to characterize the mind as a mere epiphenomenon, a side effect, of brain activity. The materialists can't have it both ways. They cannot argue both that consciousness is implicit in matter and that matter is mindless. To do this, they would have to show how consciousness arises out of unconscious matter, and this is exactly what none of them have done. As one psychologist remarked, brain activity resembles the mind about as much as a telephone number resembles its subscriber. The fundamental dynamic of reality, then, is that of Shiva and Parvati, consciousness, or self, in all its forms, and experience, or the other, in all its forms. After all, if consciousness consists of the ability to relate self and other, this polarity is and must be primary. If there is no self and other, there is no universe. Asterisk in the previous chapter I pointed out that some philosophers, notably Colin McGinn, have said that the problem of consciousness is fundamentally insoluble. McGinn is certainly right to the extent that it has not been solved by Western philosophy, whose explanations have come to resemble a wind-up toy that continues to march even though it's run up against a wall. But if we see consciousness as the capacity to relate self and other, the difficulty begins to diminish. Consciousness is now revealed as being present anywhere and everywhere in the universe. Our own consciousness is simply one particular, and not necessarily privileged, form of it. It is true that we can't say much more about consciousness than that it consists of this relation of self to other, but then we can't say anything about entities that have no sense of this relation, that is, which have no boundaries by which to define themselves at all. These observations lead to another. Nothing in manifest existence is absolutely a self or another. They are merely matters of perspective. A hydrogen atom has some consciousness, demonstrated by its ability to recognize an atom of oxygen and interact with it under certain circumstances to form water and other compounds. From its point of view, it is a self and the oxygen atom is the other. To the oxygen atom, exactly the opposite is the case. The hydrogen atom is the other, just as I am other to you and you are other to me. This fact indicates that the relation between self and other, between I and the world outside, is a constant, dynamic interplay for all entities at all scales and levels of complexity. A metaphor for this is the game known as Othello, or reversal, which employs discs that are black on one side and white on the other. Each player takes turns setting them down on a grid, and the player who has more discs of his own color on the board at the end of the game wins. If, say, you are the black player and you manage to cap a line of white discs with your own black discs at both ends, the whole line of white discs flip over to black. In the course of the game, whole lines of discs flip from white to black and back again. This process hints at the ever-shifting reversal of self and other that prevails in the universe at all levels. But to return to the dice game of the myth, where does it fit in? And why does Shiva always lose? Shiva represents what one of the Upanishads calls the sphere of seeing. Seeing in all its forms, that is, consciousness, imparts existence to the world. Nothing exists unless it is seen. Paradoxically, this includes Shiva's own attributes. They do not, strictly speaking, belong to consciousness, which in its pure form has no attributes, it simply sees. This may help explain why philosophers are frustrated in their attempts to define it. Any qualities that we can ascribe to consciousness are immediately seen, they are part of the world, and the world is Parvati. And so Parvati always wins. Her victory strips Shiva down to his pure, naked essence, which is seeing alone. For all the possible throws of the dice, that is, for all the possible directions manifestation can take, Shiva will always lose. Nevertheless, Shiva takes his defeat with aplomb and simply retreats to the forest. That is to say, consciousness can detach itself from its experience, it can free itself from its own contents. This detachment is the goal of many forms of meditation. It suggests why Shiva is characterized as an ascetic. Consider your own experience now. Most likely you are not aware of yourself, except as part of a vague background. But if you bring your attention to yourself, you can feel yourself as an I, having experiences. Many of these are sensory: this room, this chair, this book. You can go still deeper. You can be aware of your thoughts and feelings as they pass over the screen of your awareness, which is generally easier to do if you close your eyes. If you can be aware of even these most private and intimate thoughts as somehow other, then where is the I? Who or what is it? It has no attributes as such, no qualities, it simply sees. Hence the Hindu sage Sri Ramana Maharshi said that the question, who am I, taken back far enough, will lead to enlightenment. Enlightenment is customarily conceived as a somewhat shadowy concept. About all one can say of it is that it is a higher state of consciousness than we are accustomed to, or for that matter usually believe possible. In light of the ideas I've sketched out, however, we might be able to say a bit more. The consciousness that causes the world to arise is common to all things, human and non-human, animate and inanimate. There is nothing that does not possess it to some degree. But we almost never experience it in this universal way. On the contrary, it is always me, my consciousness, fenced in with rigid lines to insulate it from all others. It is precisely this rigid distinction, which is to a great extent artificial and delusory, that constitutes the sleep of man. In the words of Sri Ramana Maharshi, only one consciousness, equally distributed everywhere. You through delusion give it unequal distribution. No distribution, no everywhere. Or, as the Greek sage Heraclitus says, consciousness is common to all, but most people live as if they had their own private minds. Enlightenment, it would seem, lies precisely in the recognition of this truth, not through the mediation of concepts but directly and intuitively. It may and often does come in an instant. Such insight may be dazzling for the one who experiences it, but it may also not be. For many people, I suspect, it comes as a thief in the night, and they cast it aside in the belief that enlightenment means that the heavens open and one sees ladders full of angels going up and down, or that one becomes instantly omniscient. In any event, this experience of insight, whether we call it enlightenment, illumination, gnosis, or something else, marks a fundamental shift in an individual's orientation. Afterward, she is not necessarily immune to the vicissitudes of life. Joys and sorrows and aches and pains come as they always have. But in a subtle way, they have lost their hold on her. They are no longer absolutes, to be taken at face value. She is aware of a dimension of mind in herself that is above the passing thrills and irritations of existence. This is supernally real and can never be taken away, and so is to be valued above all things. The kingdom of heaven is like unto treasure hid in a field, the which when a man hath found, he hideth, and for joy thereof goeth and selleth all that he hath, and buyeth that field. Matthew 13:44. From a certain point of view, the spiritual path can be divided into two parts. In the first part, the individual senses that what we customarily take to be reality is no such thing, that there is something much more to be found. He looks and looks for it, he reads, studies, meditates, goes to hear the lectures of wise and holy people, and undergoes many exercises and disciplines and austerities. Then, in an instant, bidden or unbidden, the realization comes, whether through the whack of a Zen master's stick or in a flash of insight that occurs during a humdrum jaw. After this, nothing can be the same again. Even the spiritual path is no longer the same. The individual is not omniscient or omnipotent, but he now knows something real and true. Study and practice also become reoriented. They now are aimed not at producing this realization but at stabilizing it and integrating it into all levels of his life and mind. Such a person even finds that his attitude towards spiritual literature undergoes a distinctive change. He begins to discern, among the innumerable books and ideas available in the marketplace, those that come from genuine knowing and those that do not. The difference is subtle but remarkably sharp. He may even pick up a book, glance through it, and find himself saying about the author, he almost knows. Preoccupation with doctrinal orthodoxies, the truth of my religion over all others, and an arrogant contempt for other points of view almost always indicate that the writer does not know. What then of Parvati? She is the world, the sum total of all experience. I use the word experience because it seems to be the most all-encompassing of the terms available. Your experience, your world, includes not only your thoughts and emotions and sensations but your memories, dreams, and imaginations. Present-day knowledge has a refined set of criteria for determining which things are defined as real, and which are not. I spell these out later, but all of your experience is real as experience. If you are delirious with fever and start to hallucinate, the delusory images you see have no objective existence, but even so you are still experiencing something. I might have picked a term other than experience, one that might be more evocative of previous philosophical outlooks. Had I chosen representation, for example, what I am saying would immediately reveal its affinities with the thought of Arthur Schopenhauer. The equivalent term in Schopenhauer's German is Vorstellung. Schopenhauer writes that the objective existence of things is conditioned by a representer of them, and that consequently the objective world exists only as representation, is no hypothesis, still less a peremptory pronouncement, or even a paradox put forward for the sake of debate and argument. On the contrary, it is the surest and simplest truth, and a knowledge of it is rendered more difficult only by the fact that it is indeed too simple, and that not everyone has sufficient power of reflection to go back to the first elements of his consciousness of things. Schopenhauer, of all the great Western philosophers, was the only one who revealed any deep or genuine understanding of the philosophy of India. And yet in our civilization, his philosophy and others like it, which are broadly grouped under the rubric of idealism, have always occupied a minority position. Why? Sometimes these theories run aground on the problem of solipsism. They may appear to reduce the entire universe to my private experience, a counterintuitive conclusion. After all, I seem to be moving around among other beings very much like me, who have or say they are having experiences very much like mine. Why should I assume that I alone am a conscious subject? The idea that I am the only being having conscious experience is so utterly untenable that practically no one has seriously tried to maintain it. Curiously, however, it's an assumption we automatically make about a significant part of our experience, the dream world. In our dreams, we encounter a reality that is in many ways similar to waking life. There are objects, places, even people. But we automatically assume we are the only genuine conscious subjects in this world. Some years ago, I had a lucid dream in which I was sitting on a seashore. Next to me was an 18-year-old boy. I became aware I was dreaming, and when I shared this insight with my companion, he said indignantly, "You mean you think I'm a dream character?" He was insulted. The interplay of dreaming and waking life is so mysterious and evanescent that, if we reflect on it, we may end up repeating the commonplace sentiment that life is a dream. Or, like certain Hindus, we might decide that the only reason we think waking life is real, while dreams are not, is that we spend more of our time in the former. Some Tibetan Buddhists practice a rigorous yoga that is intended to maintain an unbroken line of consciousness from the waking to the dream state, so as to reveal the essentially empty nature of all phenomena. Even if we don't go this far, if we have done a certain amount of introspection, we might reach a conclusion echoed in esoteric teaching. At times in our dreams, we stray beyond the boundaries of our private imaginings and enter a world that, although it is not real in the customary sense, has a certain subtle substantiality and operates according to laws that are in many respects like those of waking life. In any event, Schopenhauer's position presents other problems as well. For example, if all the universe is representation, which was there before there was anyone to perceive it? Much of this argument is based on an unconscious anthropomorphism, assuming that our consciousness is the only kind, or that consciousness deserves the name only to the degree that it resembles our own. Schopenhauer again. Animals existed before men, fishes before land animals, plants before fishes, and the inorganic before that which is organic. Consequently, the original mass had to go through a long series of changes before the first eye could be opened. And yet the existence of this whole world remains forever dependent on that first eye that opened, were it even that of an insect. For such an eye necessarily brings about knowledge, for which and in which alone the whole world is, and without which it is not even conceivable. The world is entirely representation, and as such requires the knowing subject as the supporter of its existence. Schopenhauer is willing to push his definition of a knowing subject, at least to the extent of including insects. Nonetheless, it sounds as if the world did not exist before there was someone to perceive it, even if that someone had 6 legs. Yet as Schopenhauer knew, the world existed for immeasurable eons before the appearance of anything he would regard as a knowing subject. He tries to evade this difficulty by saying that representation belongs not to things as they are, what, following Kant, he calls the thing in itself, but only to things as they are perceived. Only will belongs to the thing in itself. And will has always existed, it is eternal, beyond time, space, and causality, like the forms of Plato's philosophy with which Schopenhauer explicitly equates his concept of will. There was always will, but there was representation only after the emergence of a knowing subject. This is a problematic view, not least because it implies that time, space, and causality, which are characteristics of representation rather than of will, did not exist before the appearance of a knowing subject. This is hard to credit. Even if we stretch Schopenhauer's concept of the knowing subject to include any form of life, life appeared on Earth somewhat under 3.8 billion years ago, while the universe is currently believed to be around 13.7 billion years old. The other major Western philosopher to hold that the world is entirely composed of experience was Bishop Berkeley. According to him, objects consist of nothing more than a congeries of impressions registered by a conscious mind. A certain color, taste, smell, figure and consistence having been observed to go together, are accounted one distinct thing, signified by the name apple, he writes. And nothing exists unless it is perceived. There, that is, objective things esse being is percipi, to be perceived, nor is it possible they should have any existence out of the minds or thinking things which perceive them. The obvious objection is this: does a tree cease to exist when I turn away from it, only to reappear when I turn back? Clearly not. Berkeley replies, when I deny sensible things an existence out of the mind, I do not mean my mind in particular, but all minds. Now, it is plain that they have an existence exterior to my mind, since I find them by experience to be independent of it. There is therefore some other mind wherein they exist, during the intervals between the times of my perceiving them, as likewise they did before my birth, and would do after my supposed annihilation. It necessarily follows there is an omnipresent eternal mind, which knows and comprehends all things. For Berkeley, who was an Anglican bishop, this omnipresent eternal mind is God. Berkeley's system no doubt reconciled faith and reason for his own thinking, but most philosophers since his time have not been so convinced. Berkeley's God looks very much like a deus ex machina. Having decided that to be is to be perceived, Berkeley needs to come up with someone who is looking when no one else is. Like Schopenhauer's, this approach stumbles on its anthropomorphism. The consciousness that perceives has to be human-like. Since the non-human and inanimate realms possess no consciousness of any sort, this supreme, transcendent intelligence has to be that of a personal God. Both Schopenhauer's and Berkeley's views have much to recommend them. The world is the sum total of that which is experienced, but not just by human subjects or, for that matter, by living creatures. Consciousness, the capacity for recognition and response, is embedded in all things, and nothing could exist without it. As noted in the previous chapter, Edison says, look at the thousands of ways in which atoms of hydrogen combine with those of other elements, forming the most diverse substances. Do you mean to say that they do this without intelligence? Intelligence, or, shall we say, consciousness, is embedded in all things, and nothing could exist without it. By taking this step, we need not stretch our imaginations to conceive of how a substantial world could exist before the arrival of a knowing subject, nor must we invoke the artificial notion of a transcendent deity who exists merely to keep an eye on things. Consciousness and experience, I and the world, or heaven and earth, as they are sometimes called symbolically, are revealed as the fundamental axes of reality. We then find ourselves asking what is real. The answers to this question over the centuries can be broadly divided into two types. One is the mystical view that only what is eternal and unchanging is real. Although this idea may look highly Eastern to us today, it actually has a long and distinguished ancestry in Western philosophy, for example, in Plato. He discusses it in a number of his works, but the best known account appears in the Republic, where he contends that, in the world of sensory appearances, everything is relative. Something is beautiful in one context, ugly in another. An act that is moral in one set of circumstances is immoral in another, and so on. None of these things, then, can be counted as really having these characteristics. In a sense, they both do and do not have them. As Plato's mouthpiece, Socrates, says, it is impossible to form a stable conception of any of them as either being what it is, or not being what it is, or being both, or neither. The welter of things which the masses conventionally regard as beautiful and so on mill around somewhere between unreality and perfect reality. There is a semantic difficulty here that is often overlooked. The word in Plato's Greek that is usually translated as reality is ousia, literally, being. If we understand this point, Plato's reasoning becomes much clearer. How can you say something is when you find that, in respect to anything you can say about it, it both is and is not? How can you say something is green when it looks green in one light and yellow or gray in another? Nonetheless, the English terms are real and reality, and their etymology suggests how we native speakers of English view the matter. These words derive from the Latin res, thing. In English, reality is inextricably bound up with thingness. We see as much in the term real estate. When you buy a house, you don't care that the materials composing it were not a house in the past and someday in the, let us hope, remote future will no longer be a house. Nor do you care that in a sense the house both is and is not white. What matters is that it is a house you can see and touch and live in now, and that the plumbing is in good shape. Property matters aside, in the day-to-day world there are, I would suggest, 5 criteria that something has to satisfy in order for us to accept it as real. 1. It must be perceptible to the senses in a stereoscopic way. That is, it must resemble what it is to all the senses and from all angles. Once when I was young, I was in my room around twilight, when I glanced across the hall into my father's bedroom and saw what looked like a dead mouse in the middle of the floor. I was puzzled, because I knew we didn't have mice in the house. I looked at the object for some time, trying to figure out what it might be, but no matter how hard I tried, I could not see it as anything other than a mouse. Finally, I got up to take a closer look at it. I found it was a crumpled up piece of tissue paper that had missed the wastebasket. In this case, what had looked like a mouse proved, from a more comprehensive point of view, to be otherwise. Consequently, it was not really a mouse. 2. The object must have a certain stability. It can't appear and vanish or change form in unpredictable ways. 3. It must be publicly accessible. Anyone who is present must be able to perceive it. Anyone here principally means a sane, rational, sober adult. The testimony of children, the insane, and people who are intoxicated is viewed with much more suspicion. 4. It must be observed in waking life. Objects in dreams may appear to have many of the characteristics I've described, but even so they are not accounted as real. 5. It must obey our preconceptions about what is and is not possible. If you say you saw something that is supposed not to exist, your testimony will be seriously doubted. You may even doubt your own senses, the power of whose evidence is often weaker than that of our preconceptions. Anything that fits these criteria will generally be taken as real. If something fails to satisfy even some of these requirements, it will raise doubts. Take the typical sighting of a ghost. The apparition may not be entirely stable, it may appear and disappear suddenly. It may not seem substantial to all the senses. You may be able to see it but may also find that your hand passes through it without resistance. It may not be perceptible to everyone. One person may see a ghost standing in a corner of the room, but others who are present may not. Finally, and perhaps most important, the existence of ghosts is highly disputed. Even if the experience satisfies all the other criteria, say there are several people present who witness the same thing, it will probably be doubted later by those who were not there, and maybe by some who were, on the grounds that there is no such thing as ghosts. The criteria I've given seem to be more or less universal, prevailing over most if not all periods and cultures. What is accounted as real must fit into our preconceptions. I must add, however, that the content of our preconceptions may differ according to time and place, sometimes wildly. Many cultures today give far more credence than we do to such things as ghosts, spirits good and evil, possession, witchcraft, and similar things. So, for that matter, did Western civilization 500 years ago. It's strange to read court testimonies from the era of the witch hunts and encounter a man who confesses to turning himself into a toad, along with the judge and jury who accept his testimony. We can see how these criteria work by examining cases where the reality of a thing is subject to doubt. The parapsychologist Andrija Puharic tells of a study of the Indian rope trick. Long a mainstay of fakirs, the trick runs so relentlessly counter to our views of reality, and even of what sleight of hand can accomplish, that some have denied it has ever been done at all. Puharich describes a demonstration of this trick arranged by some scientists. Dr. Rudolf von Urban, Dr. Alexander Pilch, and some colleagues made a study of the Indian rope trick. They were interested in the problem of mass hallucination, and it was their idea that the Indian rope trick would serve as a good experiment for their purposes. They collected several hundred people and a fakir to put on the show. They saw the fakir throw a coil of rope in the air and saw a small boy climb up the rope and disappear. Subsequently, dismembered parts of this small boy came tumbling to the ground. The fakir gathered them up in the basket, ascended the rope, and both the boy and the fakir came down smiling. It is astonishing that several hundred people witnessed this demonstration and agreed in general on the details as described. There was not a single person present in the crowd who could deny these facts. However, when the motion pictures of this scene were developed subsequently, it was found that the fakir had walked into the center of the group of people and thrown the rope into the air, but that it had fallen to the ground. The fakir and his boy assistant had stood motionless by the rope throughout the rest of the demonstration. The rope did not stay in the air, the boy did not ascend the rope. In other words, everyone had witnessed the same hallucination. Presumably the hallucination originated with the fakir as the agent or sender. At no time in the course of the demonstration did the fakir tell the audience what they were going to see. The entire demonstration was carried out in silence. How does this fit with our criteria for reality? In the first case, the idea that someone might throw a rope into the air and climb up it runs contrary to our preconceptions of how the world is, so this alone would give cause for suspicion. What proved the trick to be a hallucination was the testimony of the camera, which gave a more stereoscopic view, in this case presumably because, unlike the minds of the spectators, it was not prone to suggestion. For those who might trust in the camera, which is supposedly incapable of deceit, I might cite a phenomenon discussed on the internet, OBS. To quote Daniel Pinchbeck, author of 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, writing on the Reality Sandwich website, OBS are best known as those mysterious balls of light that have appeared on digital photographs for the last 15 years, though some claim they can see them with the naked eye as well. OBS have spawned an enthusiastic subculture of people who believe the blobby wisps are not dust particles or lens anomalies, but angels, spirits, other dimensional beings and so on. Most people first discover OBS when they are trying to photograph something else, friends at a party, a politician, their cat. In this case, it would appear to be the camera that is suffering from the delusion. Again, the doubt is triggered by our preconceptions. People generally don't believe there are orbs of light floating around the air. Moreover, orbs are not stable, they are evanescent, and they don't stand up very well to stereoscopic examination. Sometimes they show up on camera, sometimes they can be seen with the naked eye, but a rigorous criterion for reality would demand that they appear to both the camera and the naked eye and, moreover, appear in much the same way to both. A person who sees an orb, or takes a picture of one that cannot be explained as some fluke of lighting, may not be persuaded that what he saw was unreal. But someone who hears about it secondhand will probably be much more suspicious. Set down on paper, these criteria may seem utterly obvious and pedestrian. So they should. They underpin practically every move we make. They have been established as a solid basis for enabling us to function on the plane of existence that we call the physical world. They have been hashed out over millennia of human life. No attempt at vindication on my part would validate them any further, and no attempt at refutation would weaken our reliance on them. Even so, looking at them as a whole, we might notice one startling fact: a great deal of what we experience is not real, in this sense, including thoughts, dreams, fantasies, even ideas and concepts. I say more about this issue in Chapter 5, but to give a quick illustration of what I'm talking about, think of a green lion. Green lions don't exist, we can all agree on that. Yet you can imagine such a thing without too much difficulty. Assume also that you have some talent for cartooning. You make some sketches of this green lion, and soon you begin to draft some stories about it. You decide that they're pretty good, and you take them to a friend who works for a children's television network. The network likes the sketches and invites you to turn them into a series. Pretty soon you have made millions of dollars out of something that, as we agreed initially, doesn't exist. Is money itself real? The overwhelming testimony of the majority of Americans suggests that it is. In the old days, people used the expression, sound is $1. While Americans today don't have the unshakable faith in our currency that we did a couple of generations ago, we are possibly more prone than ever to account for everything in terms of its value in dollars and cents. The bottom line is a Moloch to which everything in our lives is sacrificed. But where is this supposedly real money? It no longer takes the solid form of gold and silver, much of it no longer exists even as coins or paper currency. For the most part, it consists of nothing more substantial than lines of numbers in the computers of banks and the Federal Reserve. With the great financial crash of 2008, we witnessed trillions of dollars evaporate overnight. This money existed nowhere except in the highly abstract form of putative values assigned to certain types of debt. When it was discovered or decided that there were no such values, the money evaporated and large investment houses immediately collapsed. Hence, reality, in the sense I've indicated, is only one small part of the panoply of human experience. And yet we all too often take it as the only dimension of life that is worth bothering with at all. One of the grimmest personifications of this attitude is Mr. Gradgrind, the brutally practical industrialist in Charles Dickens's novel Hard Times, a man of realities. A man of fact and calculations. A man who proceeds upon the principle that 2 and 2 are 4, and nothing over, and who is not to be talked into allowing for anything over. With a rule and a pair of scales, and the multiplication table always in his pocket, sir, ready to weigh and measure any parcel of human nature, and tell you exactly what it comes to. This is our civilization in sum, its industry and its economics and its science, and more often its philosophy and religion as well. We can look at this Gradgrindian world as it has taken shape around us and see how much we like the result. Such is the trap the West has fallen into, but it is not the only one possible. Some more rarefied and abstract sensibilities go in the other direction. Like Plato, they say that only the eternal is truly real, and everything else is milling around, somewhere between unreality and perfect reality. This is also one meaning of a familiar prayer from the Upanishads. From the unreal Asat lead me to the real Sat. From darkness lead me to light. From death lead me to immortality. The Advaita Vedanta school of Indian philosophy expresses this attitude in its very terminology. Consciousness, what the Samkhya school calls Purusha, it knows is Brahman or Atman, Atman meaning self, Prakriti is Maya, or illusion. According to Shankara, the great theorist of Advaita Vedanta, only what is changeless in the 3 times, past, present, and future, is real, all else is illusory. This is the version of Hindu philosophy that is best known in the West, but it is not the only one that exists. Another view, described by Sir John Woodroffe, the great scholar of Indian religion, is that the world is Shiva's experience and Shiva's experience can never be unreal. I say more about the relation between the Samkhya and the Advaita Vedanta in the next chapter. Certainly it would be quixotic to launch a crusade to change the meaning of the term real as it is used in our civilization. But we need not be enslaved by words. Simply by acknowledging that experience extends far beyond material substance, we can step out into new dimensions of life and mind, as the esoteric traditions have always called us to do. Trees and stones and human artifacts have solidity and obey certain laws of physics, but in their own realms, so do dreams and imaginings and our occasional glimpses of transcendent being. Shiva and Parvati play the game of consciousness on more boards than one. This comment may arouse some doubt in Buddhists, one of whose primary doctrines is anatta, or no self. I discuss this point further in Chapter 6, but for now let me say that this self-other distinction is fundamental to the universe, even if, from a Buddhist point of view, both this type of consciousness and this universe are delusory. Chapter 3. 2 Against 1 The Persistence of Dualism. When Parvati, in the guise of the bewitching untouchable, tries to coax Shiva back into her embrace, she remarks that he is an ascetic living free from duality. What exactly does she mean by this? And why should duality be a good thing to avoid? The number 2 is widely regarded as an ill omen. Because 2 is the first number to break away from unity, it is the number of the devil, and forked or two-pronged objects are frequently associated with him. Indeed, deuce is often a euphemism for the devil. Jewish and Christian mystics noted that in Genesis the second day of creation was the only one that God did not pronounce good, and the unclean beasts went 2 by 2 into Noah's ark, while the clean ones entered by sevens. And in craps, the 2, or snake eyes, is a losing throw. This unfortunate number has proved no more auspicious for the philosophical systems associated with it. The term dualism has been applied to several different theories in different fields, all of them generally discredited. In the philosophy of mind, it refers to René Descartes' view that the mind and the body are two utterly separate and distinct entities, running on parallel courses and connected only at the pineal gland in the center of the head. Descartes had his own ingenious reasons for making this claim, for example, the fact that I can imagine myself without a body, but I cannot imagine myself without a mind, since the very fact of imagining means that I have a mind. Nevertheless, few philosophers have accepted Descartes' view, partly because it seems to do little justice to the exquisite interaction between body and mind. If the two are so separate, why should the one affect the other at all? Yet, as we all know, when the body drinks, the mind gets drunk. Originally, the word dualism was not meant to refer to Descartes' philosophy. It was coined around 1700 to characterize certain religious teachings which held that the world is produced by the contention of two more or less equal forces, the good and the evil, or the light and the dark. In the purest dualistic systems, such as Manichaeism, these two forces are fundamentally irreconcilable, they do not spring from the same source and can never be harmonized. The ultimate redemption of the universe comes, not from integrating the two or even destroying the evil, but from an elaborate form of cosmic purification in which the hidden particles of light are filtered out from the darkness of matter that ensnares them. Manichaeism, named after its founder, a prophet named Mani who lived in Mesopotamia in the 4th century AD, flourished for almost 1,000 years in regions from China to North Africa. This claim is controversial, gave rise to the medieval heresies of Bogomilism and Catharism. But Manichaeism and its heirs failed to catch on in the long run. The reasons are complex. For one thing, these movements were severely persecuted by their rivals, but had a great deal to do with their gloomy exclusivism and their belief that the manifest world was irredeemably evil. By approximately 1400, they were for all purposes extinct. Dualistic religion may have been easy to eradicate, but dualistic thinking is not so easily avoided. My late friend Dr. Frederick Spiegelberg, emeritus professor of religion at Stanford University, was fond of saying that most people are Manichaeans without knowing it, making rigid and categorical distinctions between good and evil, us and them, and so on. The Russian philosopher P.D. Ouspensky makes a similar observation about the formatory center, which is his name for the mechanical aspect of the intellect. The formatory center can only count up to 2. It always divides everything in two: Bolshevism and fascism, workers and bourgeois, proletarians and capitalists, and so on. We owe most modern catchwords to formatory thinking, and not only catchwords but all modern popular theories. Perhaps it is possible to say that at all times all popular theories are formatory. More recently, psychologist Stephen Larson has pointed out that this kind of either-or thinking is prompted and enhanced by irrational fear. If you wish to induce a state of compliance in your would-be constituency, it is clearly an advantage to frighten them. First induce the fear response, and then offer them a loaded choice: be saved or be damned, convert or die. Larson links the worldwide epidemic of fanatical fundamentalism to this habit of mind. Then there is theological dualism, the belief in a creation that is radically other than its creator, so that the gulf between God and his creatures can never be crossed. Christianity in its most common forms is dualistic in this sense. Here is a more or less typical statement of the prevailing view, in the words of the Presbyterian moderator of the Society Religion, Christian News Group: Christianity conceives of God as one. But it is not an isolated one. Rather, God is a person, who is capable of affecting and being affected by others. In contrast to pantheist and related concepts, the creation is genuinely distinct from God. The world has a genuine existence of its own. God cares about and interacts with the creation. Human beings are responsible to God. As the creator, God is responsible for the world and its history. While the world is distinct from God, it is not completely independent. God is thought of as continuously sustaining the world. Contrast the foregoing with this view, stated on the website of the Florida-based Center for Non-Dualism. Non-dualism is the orientation that there is one absolute reality without a second, and that each of us, although an individual person, is one with that reality, just as a wave is not separate from the ocean. Most Christian theologians would find it hard to agree with this statement. Even attempts to transcend dualism often end up doing unwitting obeisance to it. In his book The Coming of the Cosmic Christ, the renegade Dominican monk Matthew Fox lashes out in denunciation of dualistic thinking. War is by definition anthropocentric dualism carried to its logical conclusion. I kill you, you kill me, we kill them, they kill us. But in order to save us from this mentality, he gives a list of things we must move away from and toward, all set out in a helpful two-column format. What could be more dualistic than that? These types of dualism are not my focus here, but I've mentioned them because, while dualism is frequently attacked, it is not always clear which form is the target. The type of dualism that I discuss here is the sort typified by the Samkhya and certain other forms of traditional philosophy. I bring attention to it not out of some arcane interest in obscure Eastern systems but because it touches profoundly on our notions of, and experience of, reality. First, however, it's probably necessary to say something about the Samkhya. It is considered to be one of 6 orthodox darshans, or perspectives, on the Hindu sacred texts known as the Vedas. Of the other 5, 1, yoga, is a household word in the United States, but the traditional yoga is not an array of stretching exercises, it is a rigorous system of meditative practice that is meant to confer moksha, or spiritual liberation. Another of the 6 darshans, Vedanta, is well known to students of Eastern philosophy. I will say more about it later. The other 3, Mimsa, Nyaya, and Vaisheshika, are recondite schools dealing mostly with logic and cosmology and are all but unknown here. Samkhya in Sanskrit means something like enumeration, but might be better rendered as analysis. It is a system that analyzes reality into its fundamental components, not for the sake of mere speculation, but as a means of spiritual liberation. Although I've just said that the Samkhya and Yoga are 2 separate perspectives on the Hindu sacred tradition, this was not always the case. Heinrich Zimmer, the great scholar of Indian religion, points out, these 2 are regarded in India as twins, the 2 aspects of a single discipline. He comments, as we read in the Bhagavad Gita, puerile and unlearned people speak of enumerating knowledge, Samkhya, and the practice of introvert concentration, yoga, as distinct from each other, yet anyone firmly established in either gains the fruit of both. The state attained by the followers of the path of enumerating knowledge is attained also through the exercises of introvert concentration. He truly sees who regards as one the intellectual attitude of enumerating knowledge in the practice of concentration. The two systems, in other words, supplement each other and conduce to the same goal. Originally, then, the Samkhya was regarded as the theory and yoga as the practice. It's particularly striking to realize that the Sanskrit root of yoga is unity, to yoke, cognate with our own word yoke. If we render the word as integration, the two perspectives together are defined as analysis and integration, and are revealed to be complements of each other. Something must be broken down and something else integrated, rather as in the old alchemical formula, solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. The origins of the Samkhya are lost in the remote past. Traditionally, its founder was held to be one Kapila, a sage about whom nothing is known. He is sometimes identified with a monk of that name in the Indian epic cycle, who slew the 60,000 warrior sons of a king with one glance. The 19th century esotericist H.P. Blavatsky explains the myth. The 60,000 sons, brutal, vicious, and impious, are the personification of the human passions that, a mere glance of the sage, the self who represents the highest stage of purity that can be reached on earth, reduces to ashes. In any event, the first ideas resembling those of the Samkhya can be found in the Katha Upanishad, dated to as early as the 4th century BCE, and, as we've just seen, in the Bhagavad Gita, dated roughly to between 500 and 200 BC. The period of the classical Samkhya, however, is AD 300 to 600. Its crowning text is the Samkhyakarika of Ishvara Krishna, which must have been well known by AD 560, as it was translated into Chinese around that date. Whether the Samkhya still survives as a living philosophical tradition in India is unclear. A couple of years ago I asked this question of a Hindu scholar with whom I happened to be chatting. He told me that it did not survive, that it had been absorbed by other philosophical schools, particularly the Vedanta. The scholar K.B. Ramakrishna Rao, writing in the 1960s, asserted, the Samkhya is an outmoded school of thought now. If at any time Samkhya is mentioned, it is only as an adversary. It has only a historical value and its influence as a philosophy has practically disappeared. But this may not be entirely the case. Gerald J. Larson, perhaps the foremost scholar of the Samkhya in the West, writes, I had been under the impression that Samkhya was no longer a living tradition in India. But then he discovered a monastery by the name of Kapila Matha in the Indian state of Bihar that claimed to be practicing Samkhya Yoga. Probably the best known presentation of the Samkhya in the West is in To Live Within, a highly regarded memoir by Liesl Remond about her studies in a Himalayan hermitage with the Samkhya master Sri Anirvan 1896-1978, in the middle of the 20th century. Living or defunct, the Samkhya, as I've said, is a philosophical teaching that is meant to confer spiritual liberation. What is it liberation from? From the conventional, limited, and delusory view of reality. This view is represented in every transitive sentence. There is a subject and an object, two separate things linked by an action represented by a verb. Subject right pointing arrow, verb right pointing arrow, object. This stance is so apparently rock solid that it can be difficult to shake oneself free from it. Meditation in its many forms is one way of doing so, but there are others, including, of course, spontaneous insight. To taste the experience of liberation, simply close your eyes while remaining alert. Watch the thoughts flicker across the screen of your mind like images on a film. At first you may feel attachment or aversion to some of these images. They are emphatically mine or not mine, that is, they are accepted or rejected depending on any number of factors. But if you can begin to relax these automatic responses, you can watch these impressions more impartially, neither clinging to them nor pushing them away. You realize that they come and go on their own, there is not much you can do to stop them. At the same time, this very realization opens up a certain amount of space between you and these thoughts, no matter how intensely you ordinarily identify with them. You recognize that they are not you. You begin to intuit the fact that you are actually the silent, nameless, qualityless watcher that observes all these things. Your experience begins to take this shape. Watcher right pointing arrow impressions. The watcher is what the Samkhya calls Purusha. Here is how the Samkhyakarika characterizes Purusha. It is a witness, possessed of isolation or freedom, indifferent, a spectator, and inactive. The stream of impressions is Prakriti. It is not conscious, but, because of the proximity or association of the two, i.e., Prakriti and Purusha, the unconscious one appears as if characterized by consciousness. To glimpse this truth that what is conscious in us is distinct from what it experiences, even internally, gives a profound insight into human nature and destiny. As Larson writes, man's deepest selfhood, according to classical Samkhya, is not his empirical ego structure or even his intelligence. Man's deepest selfhood is rather the very fact of consciousness. The relationship between Purusha and Prakriti, between consciousness and its experience, is subtle. Indeed, the disputes on this point mark some of the principal differences among the various Hindu schools of philosophy and between these schools and Buddhism. It's important to touch on some of these differences because of the light they cast on the nature of mind. To begin with, as we've already seen, Prakriti is not conscious. Why? Because it is by definition that which is seen, it is in its entirety the contents of consciousness. But as noted in the quoted text, because of the presence of Purusha, the unconscious one appears as if characterized by consciousness. Prakriti acquires a kind of fictitious consciousness because Purusha is identified with it. Or as the myth puts it, Parvati cheats Shiva out of his attributes. As paradoxical as this may sound, it is nothing more than you can see with even a little meditative experience. Usually you believe that the stream of thoughts and feelings that goes through your mind are you identify with them. But if you step back and look at them, you can see that they are not you. Actually, the very fact that you can see them from a distance proves that they are not you. What is you is the silent witness that is ever present, ever seeing, and ever still. Prakriti, by contrast, is unconscious but perpetually active. It is the source of all the movement, energy, and dynamism of the universe. As you know, you can't stop the movement of the universe for a single second. In fact, you can barely stop the movement of your own thoughts for a single second. This is the power of Prakriti. In Hindu philosophy, this power has a name of its own, Shakti, the primal energy that animates all things. The occult philosophers of the European Renaissance had a similar concept. They called it Anima Mundi, the soul of the world. Shakti is the source and substance of the endless doing that constitutes so much of our lives and indeed of the universe. The Samkhya does not speak of Shakti as such. Rather, it divides the action of Prakriti into three gunas, or strands. One is Rajas, the source of all movement. The second is Tamas, inertia. The third is Sattva, the force of balance and equilibration. Everything in manifest existence is made up of these three forces in varying degrees of admixture. It is not hard to see in the gunas the sacred ternary that undergirds many esoteric traditions. Gurdjieff spoke of three forces, which he called wholly affirming, wholly denying, and wholly reconciling. These can be related to Rajas, Tamas, and Sattva, respectively. So can the traditional Chinese trinity of heaven above, earth beneath, and man, the entity that connects the two. Even the Christian Trinity resembles this schema, with the ever-begetting Father, the ever-begotten Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Comforter or Reconciler. Nor should this surprise us. If these truths are universal, they must have been discovered and known universally, no matter about the differences in names and nuances. The next phase of insight is more difficult. It requires you to see not only your thoughts but your own actions, and your impulses toward action, as external to the self. Now it is not so much, I want to move, but rather, the impulse to move arises. This impulse arises out of Prakriti. Action may well follow, you get up. But here too the entirety of the action, the impulse toward movement, as well as the action itself can be revealed as nothing more than a collection of impressions. The silent watcher does not do them, rather it watches these impulses, the activity of the gunas, arise and cohere and dissolve. It is, as the Samkhyakarika says, inactive. The watcher, then, turns out to be rather passive. It has been characterized that way by other traditions as well. Esoteric Christianity, which is not so far from the Samkhya as one might think, frequently speaks of passions. These are not the same as the passions that we ordinarily think of when we consider the term. Probably the best word for them in present-day English is impulses, which has something of the impersonal and quasi-external connotation that is necessary. Our word passion is derived from the Latin pati, to suffer. It has the same root as passive, as is obvious on the printed page. Passions are not something that consciousness does, rather they are something it experiences, it suffers in every sense of that word. In the Samkhya, the whole process of spiritual liberation is cavalier, or isolation, the detachment of Purusha, or primordial mind, from its experience. You are not your thoughts, you are not your feelings, you are not even your actions. This realization is expressed in the myth of the dice game. Shiva, having lost all his attributes to Parvati, goes off, unruffled, to the forest to live the life of an ascetic. Purusha has no attributes, they all belong to Prakriti. That is why Purusha always loses the game. But since these attributes are not part of it to begin with, it loses nothing in actuality. Here is how the Samkhyakarika characterizes this state. Then, the Purusha, comfortably situated like a spectator, sees Prakriti whose activity has ceased due to the completion of her purpose, and who has turned back from the seven forms. Says the indifferent one, or spectator, I have seen her. The other ceases saying, I have been seen. Though the two are still in proximity, no further creation takes place. Although in this passage Purusha is comfortably seated like a spectator, the ultimate Samkhya goal of isolation, the utter and irreversible divorce of consciousness from all of its experience, does not offer an attractive prospect to the Western sensibility or, possibly, to any sensibility. In fact, the Samkhya may have gone into eclipse partly for this reason. The description of the state of salvation as cavalier isolation is a stark, austere mode of religious thought, which obviously would exercise little popular appeal, as Larson observes. There are other likely reasons for the decline of the Samkhya. Some are of little concern here: political instability in India in the late first millennium AD, the increasing ossification of the Samkhya into a standardized system that allowed little room for original thought, and its reluctance to generate religious institutions. But the stark and nihilistic picture of salvation must have been one of the most crucial factors. To many, the Samkhya goal of cavalier must have looked as dispiriting as agnostic materialism did to me at Oxford. Another element in the Samkhya's decline may have been its teaching that there are many Purushas. That is to say, there is not one great consciousness in which all partake but any number of atomized bits of consciousness that can only be liberated and sent into ultimate isolation. This too was no doubt dispiriting. Moreover, the reasons posited for it in the Samkhya are not convincing. The plurality of Purusas is established because of the diversity of births, deaths, and faculties. Because of actions or functions that take place at different times. And because of differences in the proportions of the three gunas in different entities. This argument is easily refuted. If, as the Samkhya says, Purusha and Prakriti are radically and ultimately distinct and have nothing to do with one another, how could all these actions, functions, births, deaths, gunas, and so on have anything genuine to do with Purusha? They too are elements of Prakriti. Therefore the concept of the plurality of Purushas collapses, and we are left with one, single, indivisible Purusha, one universal consciousness that, because of its mistaken self-identification with the doings of Prakriti, imagines itself to be plural. The Vedas, the sacred scriptures from which all orthodox Hindu systems claim their authority, portray Purusha as man, the cosmic human, or, in the words of Heinrich Zimmer, the living entity behind and within all the metamorphoses of our life in bondage. A Vedic hymn says, the man, literally Purusha, has 1,000 heads, 1,000 eyes, 1,000 feet. He pervaded the earth on all sides and extended beyond it as far as 10 fingers. It is the man who is all this, whatever has been and whatever is to be. He is the ruler of immortality. Such is his greatness, and the man is yet more than that. All creatures are a quarter of him, 3/4 of him are what is immortal in heaven. Purusha is not a familiar term even among many Westerners who are interested in Hindu philosophy. A more common word is Atman, often rendered as self, usually capitalized. This usage comes from the Advaita Vedanta, which is by far the best known of all Hindu philosophies in the West, largely because many of the most illustrious Hindu mystics of the past century and a half, such as Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Ramana Maharshi, belonged to this school. Advaita means non-dual. There are dualistic and semi-dualistic forms of Vedanta, but they are almost unknown in the West. Unlike the Samkhya, Advaita Vedanta teaches that mind consists not of an infinite number of atomistic Purushas but of one single Atman. Moreover, Atman is Brahman, the supreme creator. There is no dualism, that is, there is ultimately no distinction between the self that lies embedded in each of us, located in the heart and no bigger than a thumb, according to one of the Upanishads, and the creator of the universe. This view, taken to its logical conclusion, overturns even some of the doctrines often associated with Hinduism. My friend Dr. Spiegelberg once told me of a conversation he had with Ananda K. Kumaraswamy, the great scholar of Indian religion. Dr. Spiegelberg asked Kumaraswamy if he believed in reincarnation. Kumaraswamy said nothing for a painfully long time, perhaps 5 minutes. Finally he replied, no. It is all Brahman. It is all one. To Kumaraswamy, even the concept of an individual self that reincarnates was, in an ultimate sense, false. All beings are mere manifestations of Brahman, the creator and soul of the universe. This may not be much consolation to those who want to be assured of personal survival, but then it is saying that personal survival is not necessary. Personal survival is ultimately only an obstruction to the knowledge of the immortal and indestructible self. Illusion, Maya in Sanskrit, plays a crucial role in Advaita Vedanta, for reasons that may already be plain. If everything is actually one, where does the multiplicity of things come from? Multiplicity can't be so in fact, it must be merely appearance. Hence the manifest universe is illusory, but not in the way we customarily understand that word. To us, a mirage is an illusion, it is an image of something that is not there. Maya to the Vedantins is different. As Hans Torvesen explains in his introduction to the Vedanta philosophy. Where this Maya mirage obtains, and for most people it is very much there, it is not only taken for real but also for the totality of reality. Yet the moment enlightenment occurs, the whole mirage vanishes in a flash. The comparison with someone waking from a dream is obvious. We may laugh about it afterward. Over and over in Vedanta literature we find enlightenment an illusion compared to a rope taken for a snake in insufficient light. For the person experiencing this, the illusionary snake is very real indeed, but in bright light the imagined snake is instantly revealed to be just a rope. The rope snake analogy resembles the incident mentioned in Chapter 2 in which I mistook a crumpled piece of tissue for a mouse. But the thrust of the Vedanta metaphor is different. Everything we see is like a rope mistaken for a snake. We misunderstand the fundamental nature of everything. As Kumaraswamy says, it is all Brahman. It is all one. In this discussion we must avoid the semantic trap hidden in the words real and reality. As I've already pointed out, in English these words are very closely tied to thingness. To say a thing is unreal, then, is very much like saying a thing is not a thing, an obvious contradiction. The Vedanta does not say that. Rather, it says we fail to recognize that all things are manifestations of the One. In the words of Shankara, the greatest exponent of the Advaita Vedanta, man drinks the wine of Maya, becomes deluded and begins to see things as separate from each other, so that he talks of you and I, perceiving the world as a series of separate, isolated entities as Maya, and realizing the truth as enlightenment. Shankara also writes, all the things which we perceive exist here within, in ourself. Within is the whole of this universe. By Maya it appears as external, like one's own body in a mirror. In his most renowned work, The Crest Jewel of Discrimination, Shankara discourses on the nature of Maya. She has no beginning. She is composed of the three gunas, subtle, beyond perception. It is from the effects she produces that her existence is inferred by the wise. It is she who gives birth to the whole universe. She is neither being nor non-being, nor a mixture of both. She is neither divided nor undivided, nor a mixture of both. She is neither an indivisible whole, nor composed of parts, nor a mixture of both. She is most strange. Her nature is inexplicable. There is another sense in which the Vedanta contends that the world is illusory. When you awaken from it, the world ceases to exist. Another classic Advaita text, the Yoga Vishishtha, says, as soon as we come to know our true nature, the supreme reality, all sensations, perceptions and conceptions wither away. With the direct knowledge of the supreme reality, we directly cognize their absence. Although Shankara took great pains to refute the Samkhya philosophy, the difference between the Samkhya and his Advaita Vedanta are comparatively small and subtle. As the Vedantan Swami Prabhavananda has observed, the concept of Prakriti corresponds, more or less, to Shankara's concept of Maya, but with this important difference, Prakriti is said to be other than, and independent of Purusha, the absolute reality, while Maya is said to have no absolute reality but to be dependent on Brahman. This makes sense as far as it goes, at least if we interpret it to mean that there can be no experience Maya or Prakriti, without an experiencer Brahman or Atman in the Vedanta, Purusha in the Samkhya. All the same, much of the Advaita Vedanta is frustrating. Like many non-dualistic views, it stumbles at this question. If everything is Brahman and Brahman is all-knowing, indeed Brahman is knowing, how did this delusion known as Maya come to exist in the first place? How did pure knowing give rise to not knowing? The Vedanta's answer is more than a little vague. Shankara writes, the sun's rays bring forth layers of cloud. By them, the sun is concealed, and so it appears that the clouds alone exist. In the same way, the ego, which is brought forth by the Atman, hides the true nature of the Atman, and so it appears that the ego alone exists. Swami Prabhavananda adds, we are forced to conclude, as Shankara does, that Maya, like Brahman, is without any beginning. Ignorance is the cause and world appearance is the effect have existed always and will always exist. They are like seed and tree. The coupling of the real and unreal, produced by our ignorance, is a process universally evident in our daily lives. But none of this really tells how or why the ego is brought forth by the Atman, that is, how not knowing can be produced by pure knowing. Moreover, if all is Brahman, all is one, then we might expect the Advaita Vedanta to espouse a version of what some Christian theologians call the Via Positiva, or positive way, in this context, a total identification of all things with Brahman, since all things are Brahman. The Vedanta's mystical techniques would involve ecstatic union rather than radical detachment, which one might identify with dualistic philosophies such as the Samkhya. But the thrust of Advaita Vedanta is quite the opposite. Constantly it preaches detachment. To the question, who is free? Shankara replies, he who is dispassionate. Elsewhere he says, kill this deadly attachment to body, wife, children and others. The seers who have overcome it go to that high dwelling place of Vishnu, the all-pervading. This body, which is made up of skin, flesh, blood, arteries, veins, fat, marrow and bone, is full of waste matter and filth. It deserves our contempt. Hardly a prescription for ecstatic union. This peculiar emphasis on the ultimate unity of all things, combined with the remorseless urge to detachment, helps explain why Sri Anirvan could say, modern India follows intellectually a philosophical religion which is composed for the most part of Samkhya with a little Vedanta. Every cultured person knows it. Although Sri Anirvan was a Samkhya master, I suspect that this judgment was more than just special pleading. To go any further into these issues would take us deeper into the thickets of Indian philosophy than would be useful here. So let's step back and take stock of what we've surveyed. In the first place, dualism is not so easy to avoid. There seems to remain the fundamental distinction between consciousness and its contents, that which sees and that which is seen, at all levels and in all dimensions. That which is seen is by definition unconscious. Hence the Samkhya's emphasis on the blind nature of Prakriti. Moreover, Purusha, consciousness, has no characteristics other than pure cognition. Strictly understood, it is neither infinite nor finite, neither individual nor collective. It can assume any or all of these features or none. That is why the Samkhya sees it as particular and the Vedanta as collective. Purusha is both devoid of characteristics and endlessly mutable. All possibilities are open to it, including being bound to its own experience and confusing itself with what it experiences. It can become, or seem to become, what it beholds. This is one meaning of the Greek myth of Narcissus, who drowns while admiring his own reflection in the water. Consciousness drowns in this way. As paradoxical as this may sound, it loses consciousness by being identified with its own reflections, its own experience. This is the meaning of Maya, or, to use another Sanskrit term, avidya, ignorance, or, more accurately, obliviousness. For consciousness to lose consciousness is, of course, a contradiction in terms which also may help explain why the Vedanta regards it as illusory. But in the world as we know it, this situation happens often and, for practically the entire human race, inevitably. Some kind of liberation is necessary, whether we call it enlightenment, illumination, isolation, gnosis, or some other name. This liberation necessarily requires the detachment of consciousness from its contents, in a way suggested by the exercise I sketched earlier. Regardless of what one experiences, one needs to detach the self from what it mistakenly believes itself to be. In the language of the myth, no matter how the dice are thrown, Shiva loses to Parvati. He must lose. Everything he takes himself to be in fact belongs to her. The result of this loss is, surprisingly, bliss. Shiva goes off contentedly to live the life of a forest ascetic. This is the stage that the Samkhya equates with isolation. It is not a stark, barren, nihilistic kind of isolation of the sort experienced by the heroes of existentialist novels, but the bliss of perfect freedom and equanimity. You can encounter it at times in meditation, which can produce a state of samadhi, a kind of consciousness without contents that is both peaceful and blissful. Even this phase is not the complete story. Parvati goes off in search of Shiva again, and eventually they reunite. That is, after detaching itself from its experience, consciousness reunites with it, but this time in a lighter, more balanced fashion. Purusha is no longer, like Narcissus, submerged in Prakriti. As noted earlier, the Samkhyakarika puts it this way: though the two are still in proximity, no further creation takes place. Consciousness is aware of all it experiences, thoughts, feelings, even passions come and go, but is not enslaved by these things, does not cling to or identify itself with them. We could go through the myths and scriptures of many traditions and find countless expressions of these truths. In Egyptian myth, Osiris, the personification of what the Hindus call Purusha, is slain and cut into pieces by his brother Set, who represents the force of oblivion. Osiris's wife, Isis, the force of awakening, collects the scattered pieces of his corpse and reassembles and restores life to them. In short, Consciousness is dismembered by its own attachment to and identification with multiplicity. Esoterically understood, this is death. The esoteric meaning of the story of Christ is much the same. The God-man descends to earth, he is crucified on a cross of time and space, but he rises again on the third day to new life. Consciousness takes form in the world, where it is crucified by the vicissitudes of its own experience, but in the end it does not matter. Because it is immortal and indestructible, even its apparent death is unimportant, as it will rise from the dead in a new and more glorious form. The similarity of these and many other death and resurrection myths indicates that this truth, perhaps the central one of human life, has been universally recognized and handed down over millennia. The myths may explain how this all happens, but they are considerably less explicit about why. Why should it be like this, and not some other way? The Kabbalah says that the universe was created so that God could behold God in his own reflection. Of course, insofar as this reflection is seen, insofar as it is the object of knowledge, it cannot at the same time and in the same way be the subject. That is, knowing must of necessity bring about not knowing. As I emphasized in Chapter 2, there is no absolute stance of knowing or not knowing. The knower is, or can be, known. But insofar as it has the aspect of the known, and everything in the manifest world has this aspect to some degree, it is mindless and unseeing. This is the source of the Maya and the avidya of which the Indian philosophers speak. It is also the Samsara, delusion, of the Buddhists. A text attributed to Padmasambhava, the legendary wizard who brought Buddhism to Tibet in the 8th century AD, reads, "Realize that sentient beings, from the moment they are experienced, do not possess any true existence and therefore that samsara is the primordial purity of non-arising. Prakriti, Maya, samsara, which are essentially different words for the same thing, are built into the framework of the universe as we know it, and the universe can hardly be imagined without them. They are also built into each molecule and atom and quark of our own being." Esoteric Christianity does not, of course, use the word Purusha. Its equivalent in Greek, the language in which esoteric Christianity was formulated, is nous, sometimes translated as consciousness, or mistranslated as intellect. The Greek equivalent for passions, pathe, has an etymology and connotation similar to those of the English and Latin words. Chapter 4. Constant conjunction, the problem of causation. There is one philosophical problem that surpasses all others in difficulty. At the same time, it's so important that it can make even the nature of being and the existence of God look like mere side issues. I'm speaking of causation, the idea that certain events have certain verifiable and repeatable effects, and that these constitute the bedrock of reality. Plato summed up this concept: everything that becomes or is created must of necessity be created by some cause, for without a cause nothing can be created. As we saw in Chapter 1, God or the gods have often been invoked to serve as causes of phenomena that people did not otherwise understand. As the philosopher Henry Frankfurt says of the worldview of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, the gods as personifications of power among other things fulfill early man's need for causes to explain the phenomenal world. Later, philosophers such as Aristotle posited God as a first cause on these grounds, since everything seems to have a cause that has preceded it, and since the chain of cause and effect cannot extend back forever, there must have been, as Aristotle puts it, some prime mover, whether singular or plural, that is eternal and not itself movable. God has usually been cast in this role. Invoking God as the cause of the world in this way presupposes the existence of cause and effect as we normally understand them. At first, there doesn't appear to be a problem with this. The relationship of cause and effect looks like the most rudimentary common sense. But in fact, common sense views of causation are, as philosophers have long known, extremely difficult to justify or even comprehend. As far back as 1913, the British philosopher Bertrand Russell wrote, "The law of causality, I believe, like much that passes muster among philosophers, is a relic of a bygone age, surviving, like the monarchy, only because it is erroneously supposed to do no harm. The first complete investigation of the subject goes back to Aristotle. He described 4 causes, all of which, he said, provide possible answers to the question of why a thing should be as it is. For a statue of Apollo, for example, you could say, this is marble. This is the material cause, the nature of the matter dictates in part why a thing should be as it is. You could also say of the statue, this was made by Phidias, Phidias being the sculptor who actually made it. This is the efficient cause. Another response would be, this was made to be put in the temple of Apollo, which would explain the purpose of its existence. This is the final cause. Finally, you could say, this is Apollo, which would explain why it has the shape it has. This is the formal cause. Practically every modern person who reads Aristotle's account has the same response. Most of these things are not causes in any sense in which we would understand that term. The marble caused the statue. The form of Apollo caused the statue. In fact, the efficient cause is the only one that we would acknowledge today as a cause in the familiar sense. The Greek word that Aristotle used was asia, and while cause is the best one-word equivalent for it in general, our word comes from the Latin causa, which was used by the medieval scholastic philosophers to expound Aristotle's 4 causes. It is not, perhaps, the best translation for asia here. A more idiomatic rendition would be, reason. The reasons that the statue is as it is include its material, its shape, its purpose, and its creator. Reason, in this sense, does not necessarily imply conscious purpose. This helps us get closer to what Aristotle was trying to say. In any case, one of Aristotle's 4 causes has been rigorously excluded from the concept of causation in current physics and biology, the final cause. Science, particularly in the past few generations, has obstinately insisted that there is no purpose in the universe or in any part of it. All things are simply the mindless and mechanical results of previous circumstances. Why has science taken the stack? Because to acknowledge a purpose is tantamount to acknowledging some sort of being who would have that purpose. This comes too close to the notion of God for science to accept. Nevertheless, as we've seen in Chapter I, the concept of purpose, particularly in living organisms, is hard to exclude entirely. It's difficult, for example, to accept that you simply happen to have a hand and that it happens to be useful for grasping and making things. Purpose finds its way in as part of an explanation, whether that purpose belongs to the Almighty Creator or to those humble bits of goo known as DNA. As science took shape in the 17th century and began to exclude the final cause from its worldview, it had to find a substitute. That substitute was determinism. The contemporary Dutch philosopher Menno Hulswit writes, probably the most radical change in the meaning of cause happened during the 17th century, in which there emerged a strong tendency to understand causal relations as instances of deterministic laws. Causes were no longer seen as the active initiators of a change, but as inactive nodes in a law-like implication chain. According to this view, something causes something else to happen as a result of certain invariable natural laws. The laws of thermodynamics are among the best-known examples. This determinism was challenged in what may be the most influential discussion of causation since Aristotle. It appears in a treatise of human nature, published in 1739-40 by the Scottish philosopher David Hume. Hume begins by saying that, as he looks over the whole range of things that are called causes, he can find no one characteristic they have in common. There are millions of things that are causes, but there is no one quality that all of them share. Being a cause is not a property like color or size or shape. Similarly with effects. He then goes on to say that cause and effect must therefore involve a relation. Its nature is this. We remember to have had frequent instances of the existence of one species of objects, and also remember that the individuals of another species of objects have always attended them, and have existed in a regular order of contiguity and succession with regard to them. Thus we remember to have seen that species of object we call flame, and to have felt that species of sensation we call heat, without any farther ceremony, we call the one cause and the other effect, and infer the existence of the one from that of the other. Thus, in advancing, we have insensibly discovered a new relation betwixt cause and effect. This relation is their constant conjunction. Causation, then, consists of nothing but contiguity, succession, and constant conjunction. One event follows another, it must follow close on, and this sequence must occur several times, more or less invariably. Philosophers have objected to Hume's argument by contending, for example, that not every cause immediately precedes its effect, and that we sometimes infer cause and effect relationships from one occurrence rather than many. Such objections are legitimate but not fatal, and Hume's theory can be refined in order to cope with them. The human mind is sophisticated enough to infer, for example, that smoking is constantly conjoined with lung cancer, even though you never see a person smoking a cigarette and then immediately coming down with cancer. Our entire sense of causation does seem to come from this constant conjunction, even if cause and effect are separated by other things and events between. Consider this string of digits: 53,535,353,535, 2,439 octillion 209 septillion 821 sextillion 529 quintillion 398 quadrillion 799 trillion 585 billion 354,735,053. If you look at this string only up to the point of the double slashes, you may decide that, in this string, 3 always comes immediately after 5. You would be surprised to find that 2 was the first digit to come after the slashes. If you read the string all the way across, you would come to the more accurate view that 3 always appears as the third digit after 5, hence, 5293, 5853, and so on. This holds true no matter what two numbers fall between. Using this reasoning, you don't know what the first number will be if this string of digits continues past the ellipsis, but you do know that the next one after that will be a 3, because there was a 5 3 digits before. The mind is clever enough to recognize patterns like this as well as ones that are far more complicated. What if you had volumes and volumes of these strings to analyze, and it were the case that this 5 to 3 sequence stopped after a certain point, only to resume exactly 1000 digits later? Could you keep the digits straight enough in your head so that you could discern this pattern? Probably not without a great deal of effort. Today this kind of task would be relegated to a computer, although it would still be possible. Now imagine whether you would be able to do this if it were not merely an abstract exercise but offered some real and palpable benefit to you. Say that your recognition of this kind of pattern enabled you to find food or avoid a predator. Say furthermore that this is all your mind has to do, and that it was trained to do this and practically nothing else since you were born. You would probably find that you are able to recognize even very intricate patterns with very long intervals between them. And isn't that what the senses are trained to do? Our system of vision is not built to recognize digits primarily, but it is capable of detecting far more elaborate patterns and sequences in the patches of light and color that the eyes transmit to the brain. It would seem, however, that this sense of cause and effect involves something more than mere contiguity in time and space. Hume also says that a cause is an object followed by another, and whose appearance always conveys the thought to that other. It's this process of association that, according to Hume, creates an impression of the necessary connection in our sense of causality. Strictly speaking, the strings of events and things in the world, like the digits set out earlier, do not cause each other. We simply see similarities of pattern. The mind through its own processing turns this into a necessary connection. Moreover, our sense of necessity is based on nothing more than the invariability of these conjunctions, as observed in the past. If we are used to seeing one thing always following another, we tend to say that the first is necessarily the cause of the next. If this connection appears only occasionally, we say that one thing can cause the next. The fact that events following one another are often seen as having a cause and effect relationship raises the issue of time, notoriously the most difficult thing to define next to consciousness itself. Augustine, writing in his Confessions, says, "What, then, is time? I know well enough what it is, provided nobody asks me, but if I am asked what it is and try to explain, I am baffled." Nevertheless, time is sometimes defined as the measure of change, and this is reasonably satisfactory. Take this sequence of digits. 3 and decillion 188 decillion 495 nonillion 94 octillion 832 septillion 848 sextillion 959 quintillion 209 quadrillion 320 trillion 485 billion 896 million 93,090. Assuming that the sequence continues in its present fashion, we will have a 3 recurring at every 11th space. This gives us a gauge by which to measure the somewhat random occurrence of numbers in between. Here we have a sense of time in its most basic form, the measuring of more random occurrences, events in our lives, where the patterns was in terms of reasonably constant ones, the circuit of the Earth around the Sun, the rate of decay of certain molecules. Without an immediate gauge to measure it, time takes on a highly subjective quality. The days pass in a very different way for someone confined alone in a windowless cell than they do for someone who is free to see the sun. Similarly, the amount of time that appears to pass in a dream may have nothing to do with hours and minutes on a clock. The same holds true for certain drug-induced experiences. A friend of mine told me about a time when his father was put under nitrous oxide while in the dentist's chair. He was at once transported into another life, complete with a wife and children and a house. Years seemed to pass. At one point in this other existence, he was sitting on the porch of his house, talking with a friend. Suddenly he came to in the dentist's chair. This entire alternate life had taken place within a minute or so of clock time. We could go further and say that all altered states of consciousness in one way or another distort the familiar sense of time. This is why the British psychiatrist Maurice Nicoll, a pupil of both Gurdjieff and Jung, could frame it as a rule: a change in the time sense characterizes higher degrees of consciousness. In any event, the discernment of pattern sequences underlies all our experience of the world, including scientific inquiry. A scientific formula, no matter how brilliant and intricate, is simply a means of predicting a pattern sequence of an extremely particular type. The most influential philosopher of science in the 20th century was undoubtedly Karl Popper. For Popper, scientific formulas and the like are not deterministic laws but hypotheses. Scientists do not posit universal causal laws, they frame hypotheses on the basis of past experience, that is, research. They then test these hypotheses against further experience, that is, more research. By this view, a scientific theory must be falsifiable. Some theories stand up well, such as the law of gravity or that of electromagnetism, having been tested and retested countless times, others are far more tenuous. But even the most widely accepted theory remains open to refutation, and refutation is always possible in the future, at least theoretically. To understand this point, let's return to the sequence of digits. If you read these digits in order, not seeing which one will come next, you would start out believing that 3 always follows 5. This would be a good and sustainable hypothesis until you passed the point indicated by the slashes. At that point you would have to throw your hypothesis out and come up with another, such as one stating that 3 is always the third digit after 5. You might find this to be true for enormous strings of digits, but you would still have to face the possibility that at some point, however remote, the sequence will change. So it is with all science. In the words of parapsychologist Lawrence Lashen, science is truth until further notice. Moreover, there is no way of knowing for certain that any of the sequences that we call the laws of nature will continue in the future. Philosophers sometimes amuse themselves by speculating what would happen if all natural laws were due to cease operating after, say, January 1, 2100. Of course, we cannot say that this is definitely not the case. If it were, the past would give no reliable indication of the future beyond that point. Bertrand Russell put the point wittily when he wrote, "The man who has fed the chicken every day throughout its life at last wrings its neck instead," showing that more refined views as to the uniformity of nature would have been useful to the chicken. Or as investors read in every mutual fund prospectus, past performance does not guarantee future results. Hume's portrait of causation as constant conjunction no doubt seemed radical in his time, when scientists were just beginning to formulate the allegedly invariable laws of nature that were to lay the foundation for their discipline. His ideas seem less shocking today, when physicists are describing even the motions of particles in a far more indeterminate and probabilistic way than their counterparts in the past could have imagined. At any rate, it would be hard to overstate the importance of Hume's discussion of causation to all subsequent Western philosophy. Kant wrote that his encounter with Hume was the very thing which first interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave my investigations in the field of speculative philosophy a quite new direction. From his investigations, Kant concluded that we perceive reality not directly but through the mediation of certain primary structures of experience, or as he put it, concepts which I was now certain had not derived from experience, but from the pure understanding. Kant called these concepts of the pure understanding categories, of which, he said, there are 12. They include such things as unity, plurality, totality, reality, negation, and limitation, but the most important is certainly causality and dependence. Causality is central to Kant's metaphysics. Schopenhauer went so far as to say that for Kant, the law of causality is the real, but also the only, form of the understanding, and the remaining 11 categories are merely blind windows. Kant contended that even our concept of time derives from our concept of causality and not the other way around. His theory is corroborated in a curious way by physics, all of whose laws, according to mathematician Roger Penrose, are symmetrical in time. They can be used equally well in one direction in time as in the other. That is, from the point of view of elementary physical laws, it makes as much sense for a car to spontaneously assemble itself from disparate pieces as for it to fall apart into those pieces. But we don't experience time that way, we experience it as moving forward in a single direction, the arrow of time. Consequently, some other factor must be at play. Kant is saying that this other factor is the category of cause and effect as it operates in our minds. What the world is really like, what Kant called the Ding in sich, or the thing in itself, apart from the categories as they operate in the human mind, was, he believed, ultimately unknowable. One could write a history of Western philosophy centered on how these concepts have fared over the centuries. The medieval scholastics defined truth as adequatio re et intellectus, roughly, a correlation between the thing and one's understanding of it. This corresponds to the common sense view that there is a world of objects, and that we match words up with them more or less accurately. For Kant in the 18th century, the object is almost completely occluded by the concept. The Ding in sich is at a far remove from our direct apprehension. As time passed, the Ding, the thing, would disappear almost entirely, from continental philosophy, at any rate, to be supplanted by the sign. Already in the 18th century, Johann Heinrich Lambert, a German philosopher and naturalist who was a correspondent of Kant's, not only coined the word phenomenology but also proposed to reduce the theory of things to the theory of signs. For 20th century postmodernists, reality is more or less equivalent to textuality. There are no objects and there is no real world, merely signifiers that have meaning only within a particular text. Invoking Heidegger, Jacques Derrida, the doing of postmodernism, writes, fundamentally nothing escapes the movement of the signifier and in the last instance, the difference between signified and signifier is nothing. Hence also the dictum of the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan that the signifier represents the subject to another signifier. The signified has been so completely obliterated that postmodernists regard it as naive to believe in it at all. While we can see how this philosophy arose in recent generations, with their Orwellian capacity to detach the meanings of words from objects at the whim of a despot or an advertiser, we can wonder how valid the postmodernist view is beyond the few patchy insights it offers. Certainly in the English-speaking world, with its Gradgrindian insistence on thungness, postmodernism has always been an exotic transplant, able to survive only in the hothouses of higher education. The history of the influence of Hume's and Kant's ideas makes them appear to be highly at variance. Hume launched the great impulse of skepticism that would shape, and at this point cripple, Anglo-American philosophy for over 2 centuries. Kant's thought would lead to German idealism and to its descendant, postmodernism, with all their extravagances. At the core, however, these two philosophers said nothing radically different. Kant's formulation of the categories must have been influenced at least to some degree by these reflections about causality in Hume's treatise of human nature, and how much must we be disappointed when we learn that this connection, tie, or energy of causation, lies merely in ourselves, and is nothing but that determination of the mind, which is acquired by custom, and causes us to make a transition from an object to its usual attendant, and from the impression of one to the lively idea of the other. What Hume called a determination of the mind, Kant would refine into the theory of the categories. These speculations involving strings of digits, categories, and so on may seem dry, so let's look at the matter from a different angle. Consider the celebrated allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic. In this passage, Plato's mouthpiece, Socrates, tells a story of people who have been chained in a cave from birth, with their heads fixed so that they can see only in front of them. Behind them is a fire that casts its light on the wall. People behind the prisoners are passing back and forth in front of this fire, carrying all sorts of artifacts. Human statuettes, and animal models carved in stone and wood and all kinds of materials. The ones who are chained, however, can see only the shadows cast by the fire onto the cave wall directly opposite them. At some point, one of these unfortunates is released from his chains. Finally, he is able to turn his head and see the objects and the fire that has cast the shadows. He then goes up to the surface of the earth, where he can see objects in the full light of the sun. Eventually, he makes his way back down to the cave to enlighten the other prisoners. Socrates goes on to say, suppose that the prisoners used to assign prestige and credit to one another, in the sense that they rewarded speed at recognizing the shadows as they passed, and the ability to remember which ones normally come earlier and later and at the same time as which other ones, and expertise at using this as a basis for guessing which ones would arrive next. Do you think a former prisoner would covet these honors and would envy the people who had status and power there? Like Hume's discussion of causation, this allegory is one of the most famous texts in all of Western philosophy. Few, however, have noticed that these two passages are essentially making the same point. Hume speaks of constant conjunction, Plato of benighted prisoners who confer honors for guessing which of the shadows is going to come next on the basis of the previous ones. In both cases, there is no causation, not, at any rate, in the familiar sense of the term. There are merely strings of events whose relation to one another is more or less arbitrary. It's merely the regularity of the sequence that we call causality. For the correct guessing of this sequence, we confer honor and status and power. Nobody, of course, is interested in forecasting the sequence of shadows on a cave wall, but if you view the matter in terms of scientific discoveries or of predicting the direction of the stock market, the situation takes on a different light. There is, however, at least one more difficulty with Hume's view. To a great extent it portrays events in the world as discrete and separable entities, like the digits in the strings I gave earlier. And what reason do we have for supposing that events in the world are really that way? Aren't we just as right to assume that there are actually no distinct events, that the world is instead a seamless flow of one event into another? Why should we think the world is made up of dots on a line rather than of waves on a sea? In the end, there is probably no good reason for choosing one set of metaphors over another. Each one has its own particular value in highlighting certain aspects of the world as we apprehend it. There's even a curious analogy between these speculations and the scientific conundrum of why light behaves at times like a wave and at other times like a particle. Whatever the reality is behind these appearances, and any number of philosophers from Plato to Kant have contended that it's difficult if not impossible to perceive in a pure state, it can present any number of guises. Parvati can take the form of Shiva's divine consort and of an enticing untouchable. This fabric of causal events, which we subdivide into discrete sections called, for example, the birth of the universe, the appearance of life on earth, the course of human history, the humdrum pattern of our own small lives, or for that matter, the sequence of terms and images that some call signifiers, is the garment of Parvati, or rather it is Parvati. In the language of the Simcha, it is Prakriti, the substance of nature, the sum total of what is perceived by consciousness in all dimensions and from all angles. As I noted earlier, the occult philosophers of the Renaissance called Prakriti the anima mundi, the soul of the world. It is how consciousness experiences the world, or rather it is what consciousness experiences as the world. It is how Shiva consorts with Parvati. But haven't we painted ourselves into a corner here? I have just said that consciousness can experience the world in any number of ways, but I have also invoked Plato and Kant, both of whom stressed the mind's limitations in apprehending reality. It would seem that consciousness is multiform and illimitable, and yet very much circumscribed and even deluded. The contradiction is only apparent. Let's grant that consciousness, Purusha, has the freedom to experience the world from an infinite number of perspectives and dimensions. If we take this to its logical conclusion, then the range of possibilities available to it will include partial, incomplete, and even delusory states. Consciousness is not limited in any respect. It enjoys the freedom even to deceive itself, and even truth cannot fully contain it. A far more difficult problem arises out of Hume's concept of a determination of the mind, and Kant's theory of categories. Up to now in this book, I have characterized all that exists by carving it up into two entities, that which experiences, Purusha, and that which is experienced, Prakriti. Now we see that the matter is not quite so simple. There is not only the experiencer and the experience but also the mode of experience, the way in which mind apprehends the world. For Hume the key factor here is the law of association, for Kant it is the categories. As Kant understood, you will find it very hard to imagine a world apart from these categories. A world without unity or plurality. A world without limitation or negation or causality. Even the wildest science fiction writer has never attempted to portray an alternate reality so incommensurably unlike our own. Similarly, it's almost impossible to conceive of an intelligence of any sort that does not somehow make use of associations, as Hume no doubt would have acknowledged. As soon as we begin to look into these modes of awareness, however, we realize that they are double-edged. They both enable consciousness to perceive the world and limit that very perception. Kant did not believe it possible ever to experience what he called the noumenon, the ding in sech or thing in itself, that exists apart from the categories. Plato believed in the ideas of forms, the archetypes of all things that exist in the world of pure intelligence far above the realm of sensation. This world of pure intelligence is, in the allegory of the cave, the surface of the earth to which the freed prisoner is led with some reluctance. Plato certainly considered it possible to experience the forms cognitively, through logic and dialectics and perhaps through other means, but he didn't say it was easy to accomplish. Until we can do this, he contended, we remain chained in the cave, bewitched by shadows. This throws us back on another theme we've already touched on, the idea of Maya, or illusion, or as the Buddhists call it, Samsara. For the Advaita Vedantins, Maya consists of experiencing this world in discrete bits, isolated from the Atman, or self, of cognition, rather than as the harmonious whole that it is, at least theoretically, in which perceiver and perceived are one. How does this illusion arise? As we've already seen, if consciousness is illimitable, it paradoxically retains the capacity even to be deluded and deceived by Maya. Although the precise mechanism of how this happens is extremely subtle and hard to grasp, it has been described by a number of sacred traditions, particularly those of India. And it casts the issue of causation in a new and entirely different light. In the beginning, all is consciousness. At the same time, all is unconsciousness. Why? If we define consciousness as the capacity to define self and other, at this primordial stage there is no self or other. Hence mystics have frequently used opaque and paradoxical language to describe this condition. Here is one example, from the creation hymn of the Rig Veda. There was neither non-existence nor existence then. There was neither the realm of space nor the sky which is beyond. What stirred? Where? In whose protection? Was there water, bottomlessly deep? There was no distinguishing sign of night nor of day. That one breathed, windless, by its own impulse. Other than that there was nothing beyond. From a superficial point of view, this is merely mystical mumbo-jumbo, but from the point of view of what we've just been examining, it's relatively clear. Without self and other, there is neither non-existence nor existence, neither is there death and immortality, or day and night. The book of Genesis, 2, speaks of the time before creation when the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. Genesis 1, 2. It would be easy to add examples from countless other sacred texts. At some point, and this is not a historical event that occurred once in the unfathomable past but something that takes place moment by moment, with each sliver of experience a distinction arises. Genesis puts it in terms of dividing the waters above from the waters below, and of separating night and day, a curious parallel to the Rig Vedas. No distinguishing sign of night nor of day. Indeed, there are a number of parallels between this Vedic hymn and the opening of Genesis. Out of the primordial abyss a slight, subtle, almost embryonic distinction begins to arise. There is an experience, with it comes almost instantaneously an experiencer. Consequently we have self and other, and consciousness. As the Samkhyakarika puts it, from Prakriti emerges the Great One, Mahat or Buddhi, from that comes Ahamkara. Buddhi means cognition or understanding, Ahamkara literally means, I am-ness, that is, a sense of I or self. Out of the experience of Prakriti by Purusha comes the duality of self and other, the only cause is for the sake of the Purusha. To disentangle some sense from this thicket of words, we can start by saying that Purusha is extremely passive. It potentiates Prakriti by cognizing the world, but it does nothing else. So how can it affect the world? Only by its cognition. All action, all movement, all of what calls itself will is the ceaseless dynamic of Prakriti, the motivating energy of which the Hindu philosophers call Shakti. Purusha bestows this power by its mere act of cognition, and it does nothing else. This act instantaneously produces a pure and immediate distinction of self and other, which the Samkhya calls Buddhi. Buddhi is usually translated as intellect or intuition, but these are bad choices. In fact, there is no good English equivalent. Buddhi is much subtler and more profound than either intellect or intuition in their usual senses. Perhaps the best way to give some notion of Buddhi is through a Kabbalistic concept that I believe is very closely related. Bin, the third sphere or principle of the Kabbalistic tree of life. Usually this is translated as understanding, but again this is not quite right. The Kabbalists say that bin is derived from the Hebrew preposition ben, which simply means between. Consequently, bin is the primordial distinction, the primordial between. This primordial distinction is between self and other. With this cognitive step, A certain polarity, a sense of here and there, begins to gel, and, in the words of James Joyce, a world that was not comes to pass. The most common experience of buddhi occasionally occurs immediately after waking in the morning. You sometimes find that you are alert and feeling refreshed. There is a sense that everything is all right. There are no problems, no difficulties. All is clear and new. There is consciousness, there is a sense of self and other, of here and there, but it is unimpeded, it presents no problems. But very soon, and I am talking about seconds rather than minutes, you realize something is missing, and you begin groping for it, as if you knew you could not get up without it. You remember where you are in the world. Your problems, hopes, appetites, duties all come flooding in on you. Your sense of self, your I formation, has been restored. In the language of the Samkhya, you have moved from buddhi into ahamkara or I am-ness. For the most part, it is not a pleasant experience. To use the language of esoteric Christianity, it is a fall into a world that will present you with plenty of both good and evil. Buddhi, then, gives rise to ahamkara, the fundamental sense of I. At this point, your experience congeals into what is usually called the ego. The freshness of consciousness at the moment of wakening freezes into a personality with wishes and desires and problems. As one scholar says, it is, the mind is active I becoming the standing me. Now Purusha is fixed by its identification with Prakriti. It clutches onto a small segment of Prakriti's measureless stream and calls it its own, or rather, calls it me. Like Narcissus, it falls in love with its own reflection in the ceaselessly churning world of experience and is drowned. Or, like Ayaldabaoth, the second-rate deity whom the Gnostics say molded our defective universe, it says, I am and there is no other beside me. Experience becomes my experience. Buddhi produces ahamkara, the distinction between self and other generates an I. This gives rise to events in the psychic realm, thoughts, images, mental constructs. The Samkhya calls this manas, which is mind as we usually understand it. The English word mind is derived from the Latin mens. Even on the printed page, manas and mens look remarkably similar, and in fact they come from the same Indo-European root. Manas is the sum total of thoughts, emotions, cognitions, images, and dreams, conscious and unconscious, that pass across the screen of the psyche. Manas is your customary state of mind, and it arises whenever ahamkara is present. In terms of moment-to-moment experience, manas is the stream of thoughts that the ego produces as a strategy for self-perpetuation. The thoughts that go through your mind are almost entirely means used by ahamkara, the ego, to hold itself together. Some of these are basic survival strategies. Where will I get my next meal? How can I make more money? Others are concerned with the ego's status in the world. What do they think of me? How can I look good in these circumstances? Such is manas in waking life. But even in dreaming, if we believe Freud and his school, a great deal of the activity of the dreaming mind is in service to the ego's self-concept. As soon as ahamkara and manas arise, they become problematic and even painful. The Samkhyakarika alludes to this fact in its opening verse. Because of the torment of the threefold suffering, there arises the desire to know the means of removing it. Buddhists will recognize a powerful echo here of the Four Noble Truths: the existence of suffering, the cause of suffering, the fact that suffering can be ended, and the means of ending it. Moreover, the threefold suffering looks very much like the three poisons of Buddhism: desire, anger, and obliviousness. The resemblances are so strong that the Samkhya is accounted as one of the chief influences on the Buddha's teaching. Why is suffering threefold? Why are there three poisons and not two or four? The answer is simple. Once you have constellated the world into this dichotomy of self and other, you, the self, have only three ways of responding to the other. You can move toward it, you can move away from it, or you can do neither. These are the only possibilities available in the world as we know it. In the language of Buddhism, the first is desire, the second aversion, and the third obliviousness. The Samkhya does not portray this ternary in exactly the same way, but it comes close. It speaks of the three gunas, sattva, equilibrium, rajas, excitement, and tamas, inertia. The Sanskrit word guna is usually translated as quality, although it also means rope. The gunas are the ropes that bind consciousness to its own experience. According to the Samkhya, these gunas generate the entirety of manifest existence, just as the Buddhists say that all of samsara results from the operation of the three poisons, and Christians believe that the universe is created by the Trinity. This intricate chain of manifestation can seem remote to us. As a matter of fact, it is the opposite. As the Prophet Muhammad said of Allah, it is closer than your jugular vein. You do not see this process because it happens instantaneously, on a moment-by-moment basis, and you take it utterly for granted. In the most mercilessly literal sense, you don't know what you would be without it. This is partly why the sages have insisted so strongly on meditation as a necessity for awakening. By stilling and calming the mind, meditation slows down this process of I-formation so that some of its steps can be seen and thereby loosened, and so that Purusha, pure consciousness, can begin to be freed. The sages of the Samkhya did not agree that meditation was necessary. By the way, they held that mere cognitive insight into the situation was enough to ensure liberation. The sages of the Samkhya would agree with Hame that the phenomenal world is merely a string of occurrences that, strictly speaking, have no causal connection with one another. What is causative are the gunas, which in turn arise ultimately out of the dynamic between Purusha and Prakriti, between Shiva and his capricious bride. But the gunas cannot be apprehended in their pure form. You can never see pure sattva or rajas or tamas. They are visible only in their manifestations and combinations, just as in Christianity the Trinity cannot be seen except in the mirror of creation. This whole discussion reveals causation to us in two guises. 1. The conventional view is totally flat and linear. It amounts to nothing more than recognizing sequences of events. Metaphorically, it is the discernment of repeating digits in a string of numbers, or guessing which out of a series of shadows will appear next on the cave wall. The human mind has become extremely clever in perceiving causation in this sense. It can predict when apples on a tree will ripen or where a particle will go if it is struck with a certain amount of force. But as Hame saw, this kind of causation is nothing more than an elaborate sense of constant conjunction. If we understand these conjunctions thoroughly enough, we will understand causation of the familiar sort. At the same time, nothing in this titanic string of events gives us any clue to why or how the string came about to begin with. Aristotle's first cause, an unmoved mover who in some incomprehensible way began the sequence without having a beginning himself, is no more plausible an explanation than the Samkhya's view that this string is beginningless and endless. Such is the conventional type of causation. It does not and cannot offer any real notion of God, because God here could be nothing more than another cipher in the string of events. As we've seen, God has sometimes been inserted into this string as a placeholder, an unseen agent intervening between events that cannot otherwise be explained. But this cannot be God in the real meaning of the word, if only because a simpler and more immediate agency can usually be found. After electricity was discovered, we no longer needed Zeus to stand in as the creator of thunder. God will not be found in this causal chain. If, however, we see causation in a deeper sense as the ceaseless interplay of Purusha and Prakriti, the matter takes on another guise. Buddhi, ahamkara, and the gunas arise out of this interplay, and they are the true causes of manifestation. While the Samkhya enumeration is by no means identical to Kant's theory of the categories, they share one crucial element. Both of them focus on how the world, our world, the world we see and take for granted as real, is generated by the limits and structures of consciousness. For Kant, these include such things as identity, unity, and causation. In the Samkhya, they are the capacities for thought and sense and action generated by a consciousness that has fallen into a frozen and isolated sense of itself. Where, then, is God? As we saw in the previous chapter, God can be experienced both as self Purusha and as other Prakriti. Ultimately, however, the true God is beyond and above both self and other. God is the unfathomable reality that gives rise to this divine game. The Simcha does not speak directly of this unfathomable reality, consequently, it is sometimes, and not entirely accurately, characterized as atheistic. Other traditions, however, do make mention of this reality. God is the Urgrund, the primordial ground, of the medieval German mystic Meister Eckhart, the Ein Sof, or infinity, of the Kabbalists, the Nirguna Brahman without qualities, of the Hindus. That this reality has been encountered and described so many times by so many great visionaries is one, but only one, testimony to its truth.